Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's July 24th, and we have a lot to talk about. My guest today is Dr. Kate Lorig. Dr. Lorig is a professor emerita at Stanford University School of Medicine. She served as a director of the Stanford Patient Education Research Center, and she's a partner in the Self-Management Resource Center. Dr. Lorig has authored several books and articles, and she's the lead author of the book Building Better Caregivers, a caregiver's guide to reducing stress and staying healthy. Those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while already know that after my wife Jean was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS, I stopped working and spent about a decade as her primary caregiver. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about that experience, you can visit our website at realtalkms.com and click on the About RealTalk MS page. Or you can hear it firsthand by checking out episode 1 of the podcast, where I kind of walk you through Jean's story and my story and why I think this podcast is so important. So in just a few minutes, we're going to be talking about building better caregivers with Dr. Lorig. But before we get to that, there are a few other things that you should know about. A new study published in Radiology suggests that doctors may be able to identify MS patients who are at greater risk of disease progression and disability. Researchers used a relatively new MRI technique called quantitative susceptibility mapping to measure the levels of iron in different areas of the brain in MS patients and compared their results to a healthy control group, people who didn't have MS. The research team recruited 600 MS patients for this study. 452 people had relapsing remitting MS and 148 had secondary progressive MS. They also recruited 250 healthy people to serve as that control group. They focused their MRI study on the deep gray matter in the brain, including the thalamus and the basal ganglia. Now, the thalamus is responsible for relaying sensory and motor signals to the cerebral cortex. And the basal ganglia is actually a group of structures in the brain that are primarily responsible for motor control. When they compared the MRI results of the MS patients to the control group, the researchers found that the MS patients showed an increased accumulation of iron in the basal ganglia and lower levels of iron in the thalamus. And what was interesting here is that the lower levels of iron in the thalamus correlated with longer disease duration, a higher degree of disability, and disease progression. These were the people with secondary progressive MS. Well, the research team concluded that the iron depletion or increase in these structures of the brain could act as an independent predictor of disability related to MS, and monitoring iron accumulation in the brain could help identify which MS patients face the greater risk for developing physical disability. Well, more research is required to support these conclusions, but this discovery may serve as a reliable imaging biomarker for MS progression, and that would make it a real breakthrough. If you're interested in finding out more about the study, I'll include a link to it in today's show notes. According to a study done in 2013, sexual dysfunction in MS patients had a more detrimental impact on their health-related quality of life than physical disability, which tells us that finding ways to remedy sexual dysfunction is a necessary ingredient in patient well-being. And a small study indicates that Tysabri may be effective in treating sexual dysfunction in patients with MS. MS lesions can complicate sexual response, and that can lead to difficulty with arousal and orgasm. These difficulties can be caused by a whole variety of MS symptoms, including motor weakness, spasticity, fatigue, and pain. Sexual response can also be impacted by the psychological and sociological impairment that many MS patients also live with. Since Tysabri has been shown to improve the health-related quality of life for people living with MS, specifically impacting fatigue and cognition, researchers thought that it might also help address sexual dysfunction. So in this study, the research team tracked relapsing remitting MS patients' perceived sexual dysfunction for 24 weeks after starting treatment with Tysabri. The results of this trial showed that the patients experienced significantly less sexual dysfunction over the 24-week period, and they reported experiencing an improved quality of life. These encouraging results will hopefully inspire a larger follow-up study to further explore what would be some great news for a lot of people living with MS. I'll include a link to the study results in today's show notes. Shift.ms is a social network created by people living with MS for people living with MS. And last week, they debuted Hidden, a short film that very creatively shows how the hidden symptoms of MS can impact people and get in the way of everyday life. The film is really well done, and I think they came up with a very smart way of visually illustrating how people living with MS deal with a multitude of symptoms while all the while, quote unquote, looking healthy. At one point in the film, two women with MS are talking, and one says, "You don't have to fight this alone, and you don't have to let this define you." And while that's some excellent advice, I think it would have been even more helpful to add how someone goes about fighting MS. Maybe a conversation about the availability of drugs to manage at least some MS symptoms. Or even a conversation that lets the audience know that starting on MS disease-modifying therapy can help manage MS symptoms and even delay disease progression. As one of the characters in the movie says, you don't have to let MS define you. I just wish that conversation could have continued on screen, so that we'd see how you can choose to be defined as an MS warrior, because you can't be an effective warrior until you know about the weapons that are available to you. I hope you take a few minutes to watch the film. I think it can be really useful to share it with friends or family members who might benefit from better understanding what it means to live with an invisible disease. I'll have a link to the film in today's show notes, along with a link to Shift.ms, which is a really worthwhile online resource that you should check into. You can find a lot of information on the web about how diet might impact multiple sclerosis, but there hasn't been a lot of hard science applied to these theories. So the University of Iowa is conducting a clinical trial that compares two diets that are extremely popular in the MS community, the Wahls diet and the Swank diet, to determine their effectiveness in mitigating MS fatigue. Now, the Wahls diet was created by Dr. Terry Wahls, who contends that she successfully recovered from severe disability due to progressive MS by following a modified paleo diet that emphasizes consuming 6 to 9 cups of vegetables each day and restricts the consumption of grains, legumes, and dairy products. Dr. Wahls is also a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Iowa, where the study is taking place. Now, the Swank diet was developed by Dr. Roy Swank, and it's based upon Dr. Swank's observation that the incidence of MS was higher in areas where people consumed more meat, eggs, cheese, and milk, compared with areas where people consumed more fish. So the Swank diet is designed to restrict saturated fats. This study, which has been funded with a $1 million grant from the National MS Society, is currently recruiting participants who will be asked to follow their own diet for 12 weeks, and then they'll be randomly selected to follow either the Swank diet or the Walls diet for 24 weeks. And each patient's health and activity level will be monitored over this 36-week period. If you're interested in participating in the study, I'll include a link to more details in the show notes. You can also send email with your questions to msdietstudy@healthcare.uiowa.edu. That's msdietstudy@healthcare.uiowa.edu. Or you can call area code 319-384-5002. Becoming a family caregiver is the one job that no one ever plans to apply for. The caregiver's journey is the one aspect of chronic illness that can easily be overlooked. It doesn't always get paid the proper amount of attention until the moment that a family caregiver finds themselves feeling isolated, overwhelmed, drained, and depressed. But it doesn't have to come to that. In a moment, you'll meet my guest, Dr. Kate Lorig, lead author of Building Better Caregivers, A Caregiver's Guide to Reducing Stress and Staying Healthy, and we'll find out how to go about building better caregivers. More than 40 million people in the United States alone serve as unpaid caregivers to a family member, friend, or neighbor. According to AARP, 60% of those caregivers have reduced the number of hours that they're available to work or changed their job responsibilities to better accommodate their caregiving responsibilities. The financial impact on caregivers is estimated to be a cumulative loss of more than $300,000 in earnings and benefits over their lifetime. And the financial impact probably isn't the most important or profound impact. Caregivers can carry a huge burden of responsibility that can create strong feelings of isolation and high levels of stress that can lead to depression. In fact, caregivers frequently find themselves dealing with their own physical and mental health issues even after their caregiving responsibilities have ended. So the conversation about managing caregiver burden is an incredibly important one. And that's why I'm so glad to welcome my guest today, Dr. Kate Lorig. Dr. Lorig is a professor emerita at Stanford University School of Medicine. She's served as the director of the Stanford Patient Education Research Center and is a partner in the Self-Management Resource Center. Dr. Lorig has authored several books and articles, and she's the lead author of the book Building Better Caregivers, A Caregiver's Guide to Reducing Stress and Staying Healthy. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lorig.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you.
Well, we're really glad to have you. And I know that your interest and involvement in caregiving began quite early. Can you talk a little bit about how the subject of caregiving first captured your attention?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but as a teenager, I was working as a nurse's aide in a hospital, and we had an elderly woman who probably had Alzheimer's, who at that time was basically living in the hospital. And as a youngster, I just felt totally helpless in doing anything for her and basically wanted just to avoid her. So I think that was the kind of the very first introduction to that. I have never been a full-time caregiver, at least not a family caregiver. I've certainly watched as my 102-year-old mother aged and actually passed away in this past year, and assisted both my brother and sister from afar in her caregiving.
I have to tell you that I was so intrigued initially when I saw the title of your book, and it's a great read. We're going to go ahead and put a link to that book up on today's show notes. But when I read the title, Building Better Caregivers, that title alone carries with it a lot of hope. Let me ask you, what's the biggest mistake that caregivers tend to make?
I think the biggest mistake they tend to make is that they're not good enough, and they're not doing enough, and that they could do it better, and then also that nobody could do it better than they could.
Mm-hmm.
and that they have to do everything themselves. And one of the things that some caregivers don't understand is that they chose to be caregivers. And I know people will say, well, I didn't choose to be a caregiver. My husband got sick or whatever. But in fact, many people in those situations walk out of the caregiving responsibility. One way or another, they literally, I mean, they may physically leave. There's all kinds of things that can happen. But people that are actually caring for others do this by choice. And I think the biggest mistake is that they feel like, I'm the only one that nobody can help. And what we want to let them know is that, yes, there is a lot of help around.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about so many of the caregivers I know that I talk to, my own role as being a caregiver and some of the experiences I've had. You're exactly right. In the multiple sclerosis community, it may be even a little trickier because women are 3 times more likely to get MS than men. We're not sure why that is yet, but that's a fact. So it means that more often than not, men become the caregiver to their spousal care partner. And men socially aren't always real good at, I mean, we're the guys who won't even stop and ask for directions when we're lost. So when we're put in a caregiver role, it's not one that we automatically take to.
No, I think that, I think that may be true with men, but I also think it's very often true with women as well. And part of it is just not knowing enough or not understanding what's happening. I remember a neighbor of mine whose wife advanced with Alzheimer's, which he didn't understand at all. And at times he actually became abusive. Not physically abusive, but verbally abusive. And I suggested to him things, and he just blew me off because I was younger and I was stupid. And I finally actually called Adult Protective Services and said, I don't think that this woman's in any danger, but this man needs to be talked to. And if you could send out a man, that would be really helpful. And they actually did. And she ended up going to Day Health. He was happier. She was happier. And while it certainly didn't resolve all the problems, it did resolve some, but sometimes it just takes a man talking to a man.
What do you find to be the main cause, or perhaps the biggest cause, of caregiver stress, and how can caregivers better manage that stress?
I think one of the big causes of stress are what caregivers see as difficult behaviors from the term we use is care partner, because it's not always a family member, it's not always a loved one. So we just use care partner as the person being cared for. And care partners sometimes have difficult behaviors, and what one person sees as a difficult behavior, another person doesn't. So if a caregiver says to their partner, what would you like for dinner? And the care partner says, ice cream. One caregiver says, oh, that's stupid. I didn't mean that at all, and gets very stressed and upset. Or another caregiver says, fine. I guess there's no problem with giving you ice cream. And so a lot of it has to do with dealing with the situation and how one sees the behavior. And then the other thing that helps sometimes is just being able to recognize what we see as difficult behaviors. And all difficult behaviors are those that cause us stress or frustration. And then different ways that we can deal with them.
Well, as a matter of fact, there are a lot of family caregivers listening to us today. What's one thing that they can start doing today?
I think very simply, the first thing they can start doing is looking to see if there's a trigger for their behavior. And that trigger could be if somebody wants to take the car keys and go driving, leaving the car keys out is a trigger, seeing the car keys. A trigger can be you leaving because maybe they're afraid that you won't come back, or maybe the only way they have to manipulate is, and when I say manipulate, I don't mean that in a prerogative term, but the only way they have control is a better word, is a difficult behavior. And so if we can start identifying when this happens, then this happens, then what one can do is sometimes one can change the triggers. Another thing that can help is to not ask open-ended questions unless you want an open-ended answer, such what just do you want for dinner? If you don't think ice cream is an acceptable answer, then it's a much better thing. Would you like chicken or would you like pot pie? And so you give people a choice, but you don't give them an infinite amount of choices. Some other things are when these difficult behaviors happen, look at how you as a caregiver respond. Do you respond by being tearful? Do you respond by being angry? Do you respond by giving in? And also then look at what happens to your care partner. What do they do? And sometimes by just changing the response, you can change the behavior. Now, these things take time, and they really mean that you kind of have to pay attention to what's going on. But these are some of the things that people can do.
Having just talked about things that people can do, sometimes caregiving issues get bigger than that, and issues connected to caregiving are only likely to grow as the need for more caregivers continues to grow. So what about from a public policy perspective? How do we go about, as a community, how do we go about building better caregivers?
I think that I think there's lots and lots of things that need to happen public policy-wise. I would really like to see that family caregivers get some reimbursement for their care, whether it's through Medicare or through something else. Now, the Veterans Administration is already doing this for family caregivers that are caring for at least some veterans. But I think in general, it makes good public policy because keeping people at home is much less expensive than having people in more protective environments such as assisted living or skilled nursing. So I think that that's one of the public policy sorts of things that we can do. I think another public policy thing that we can do is we can see that caregivers actually get some education in caregiving. And right now, there's programs such as ours. There's a number of very good programs out there, but they're not easy to access. So I think that's another thing. I think a third thing that we could do is we could certainly offer some respite care so that families can go on vacation. And whether that's respite care with somebody coming in the home or respite care that I know, actually I'm not sure they're still doing it, but many years ago, New Zealand everybody that was doing family caregiving had, I think, 2 weeks a year, or maybe they had a little bit more, I don't know exactly so much, but they could really go into what would be the equivalent of our skilled nursing facility. Their care partner could go there for a couple of weeks, paid for by the government, so the caregiver and their family could go on vacation. So I think that there's several things of that sort that would help public policy a lot.
As you were mentioning different programs that are available but difficult to access, it made me think of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation for people living with MS and other chronic illnesses is sometimes difficult just because logistically it's tough to access. And so what's happening now is technology is enabling rehabilitation to be brought into your home very cost effectively and very efficiently. And I'm wondering if that same sort of technology can be used to kind of bring caregiver support, maybe best practices, training, things along those lines into people's homes to make it much more accessible.
We already have a program. It's called Building Better Caregivers. It's available on the internet. That's the good news. The bad news is that unfortunately it's not easily available for people unless they're caring for a veteran or they're a veteran caring for someone else. Because right now the program is pretty much limited to use by the Veterans Administration. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult to pay for a program on a one-by-one basis. And so far there's not been the public interest or the public will to make this program available to the public in general. So it's not that we lack the program, it's a lack, again, of means of getting it to people.
We should have an offline conversation about that, because I would love to connect your folks with other folks who might be able to move that forward on a larger scale. I think you've shared some wonderful thoughts and some clear ideas of what people can do and how they can be thinking about a caregiving role. And I think starting from that foundational thought that this is something you choose can make a big difference. So, Dr. Lorig, thanks again for all of the caregivers that you have provided so much help to through your programs, books, etc. And thanks for talking with us today.
Well, thank you, and especially thanks to all those caregivers, because you carry a huge burden, and I don't think you get thanked enough. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I thank all the caregivers for listening.
Well, that's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new Google Podcast app. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.